history's most one-sided wars. There's that quote about all being fair in love and war, but I don't think that someone swinging their sword at an Ordnance BL 5-inch howitzer artillery cannon would find it very fair. Well, that's pretty much what happened during the Battle of Omdurman. Now, if you're familiar with African history around the turn of the 20th century, you know that it was nothing short of a shit show. European powers were grabbing anything and everything they could get their hands on to see what natural resources could be tapped into. As for the British, one of their more tactical moves was seizing control of the Egyptian territory from the Ottoman Empire in the late 1880s. Why Egypt? Well, because Egypt has the Suez Canal, basically a super sweet shortcut connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and thus the Indian Ocean. Guess who owned India at the time? Also the British. So instead of slogging the freshly plundered raw materials all the way around the scenic circumference of Africa, merchants could just speedrun that shit through the Suez, potentially saving months of sailing. Now, with the seizure of Egypt came a bit of a bonus, some territory to the south, known as Sudan. But it came with some baggage of its own. If Egypt were to be the crisp, clean shirt in the deal, Sudan was going to be the pants. And these pants were about to be shat. So while the British now controlled Sudan on paper, it wasn't really the case in reality, at least not yet. Throwing even more chaos into the mix were the not-so-modest Mahdists, an independent Islamic group that rose up and rebelled against their Ottoman Egyptian oppressors, establishing their own state in the Sudanese territory back when the Ottomans controlled the region just a decade earlier. They didn't give a flying flip that the British were now the technical rulers of the land. Oppressors were oppressors. As a matter of fact, they were feeling a bit big in the britches after just toppling the Ottoman control, so they were eager to start round two. The British, though, initially wanted to abandon Sudan, declaring it too much of a political and financial burden to deal with, what with all the squabbling and whatnot. They would instead leave the Mahdists to have their own land and not intervene. However, continued Mahdist aggression led to the death of one Charles Gordon, a renowned British general who was tasked with evacuating civilians from the Sudanese spit-sounding capital city of Khartoum. Mahdist soldiers slaughtered around 10,000 innocent civilians in the wake of Charles's assassination. This single act switched British opinion from indifference to vowing vengeance. Thus, in 1896, the British began the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of Sudan. This war lasted about 3 years, with British forces steamrolling the Mahdists in virtually every encounter. Well, if it's so one-sided, why did it take 3 years? Good question. This was actually by design. You see, the British were slowly advancing into Sudan, building a supply railroad behind them the whole way so as to not have supplies run dry and be caught with their pants down, an issue that had previously plagued the British in the past. The conquest culminated in the Battle of Omdurman on September 2nd, 1898. Oof, just lasting a single day, huh? Talk about foreboding. Yeah, so this battle wasn't so much of a battle as it was a full-blown massacre. Here's where the one-sidedness kicks in. About 26,000 British and Egyptian troops faced off against over 50,000 Sudanese warriors. Seems like a slam dunk for Sudan, but sheer size is no match for optimal equipment. Remember that supply railway I just mentioned? Well, it supplied the British front lines with 17,000 rolling block rifles, 8,000 bolt-action rifles, 44 artillery cannons, and 40 state-of-the-art water-cooled Maxim automatic machine guns. Oh yeah, there was also a handful of naval gunboats ready to tear shit up from the banks of the Nile. The Mahdists, well, you know, they tried. They had several thousand firearms seized from previous battles, as well as a few dozen artillery, but yeah, they were either poorly maintained or those operating them were poorly trained. The unlucky fellows not equipped with firearms instead brandished the old reliable sword and shield, and it went just about as well as you'd think. The Mahdists were completely and utterly destroyed. According to 23-year-old British Lieutenant Winston Churchill, yes, that Winston Churchill, approximately 11,000 Mahdist soldiers lay dead, 16,000 wounded, and over 4,000 captured. The rest either surrendered or just fled. As for the British, less than 50 soldiers were killed in battle, a testament to the sheer imbalance of weapons technology and tactical warfare. After the battle, the Mahdist state was effectively dismantled, cementing British dominance in Sudan. Sometimes, wars can be won without inflicting any real damage. You just have to be well-versed in the art of intimidation. Even if you're a tiny pushover, you can still get your way if you make yourself seem scary enough. The Kettle War is a prime example of this tactic. At the end of the 80 Years' War back in 1648, the Dutch gained independence from the Spanish. In addition to establishing their own little republic within the Netherlands, the Dutch had full access to a gaping mouth. The mouth of the Scheldt River. This was a critical trade route for many cities just south of the newly formed republic, cities that were still under smelly Spanish control. So the Dutch took advantage of the situation. Oh yeah, time to close the river. The Dutch cut off all trade access through the Scheldt, completely crippling the economies of the downstream cities. Instead, trade was diverted through the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, allowing them to flourish into dominant trade hubs. The funny thing though, nothing would be done about it for 136 years. But in the late 1700s, there was a new sheriff in town for the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II, and he did not like the Dutch doing what they were doing. As a rather ambitious reformer, he was aiming to make his empire the main political and economic power in Europe, but the whole closure of the Scheldt thing was a big old turd in the punch bowl of his plans, so he needed to act, and act he did. Having just gotten their stront kicked in by the British during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1784, Joseph II decided to take advantage of a now weakened Dutch republic. The demand was simple: open up the river or go to war. Now, when your territory is like this and another territory threatening you looks like this, it might be best to just let them have this one. In reality, however, the Holy Roman Empire's army was fairly scattered across the mainland, being particularly small and ill-equipped near the Netherlands, so the immediate threat was minimal at best. As a show of force though, and to keep up the illusion of strength, Joseph sent out a small squadron of 3 naval warships, led by the heavily armed, no-nonsense having flagship Le Louis. The ships were sent to the mouth of the Scheldt to sit there and look intimidating. The Dutch, however, called the empire out on their bluff. On October 9th, 1784, they intercepted the 3 opposing warships with one of their own, the Dolphin, and it was looking to blow some holes into other ships. In an act of intimidation of their own, the Dolphin fired a single warning shot towards Le Louis. A soup in the morning, a soup at night, a soup every day makes me feel right. Oh man, now I'm super depressed. The warning shot from the Dolphin whizzed through the galley of Le Louis, causing the casualty of a single soup kettle. Hilariously, the crew of Le Louis surrendered immediately, chalking up a victory for the Dutch Republic with a single cannon shot. Joseph II, not to be embarrassed, declared full-on war, but no violence ever came of it. Instead, both agreed to negotiate. The result? The Scheldt remained closed, but the Dutch would compensate the Holy Roman Empire a hefty sum for the inconvenience. Around 2 to 10 million Dutch guilder, or roughly $120 to $600 million in today's money. I'd say that compensates for the soup. My soup. War and drugs is a pretty solid combination, but when said substances are used in warfare, it becomes a whole other matter entirely. Let's touch back on the early 1800s. Despite being halfway around the world, the British Empire still commanded trade in the Indian Ocean, even stretching into the Pacific, with one of their main suppliers being Imperial China. The Qing dynasty was doling out all kinds of goods to the Brits, including earthy herbs, soft silks, precious porcelain, and the iconic British life fuel, tea. While this trade was good for the British consumer, the rather one-sided trade imbalance left British merchants a tad miffed. The British Empire was absolutely hemorrhaging silver to pay for all of the goods with no reciprocity. The Chinese simply had little to no interest in British goods like wool or cotton. And that was a problem as British silver reserves were drying up, putting a damper on the liquidity of trade in the region. So what do you do if there's no demand? You force it. The British began secretly exporting Indian-grown opium into Chinese ports. Smugglers paid for the opium with silver, which then paid for more Chinese goods, completing a more sustainable trade loop. British merchants were happy, Chinese smugglers were happy, the majority of the Chinese population were suffering crippling addiction. You know how it goes. So yeah, it's no surprise that opium demand soon turned exponential. From 1797 to 1833, opium imports soared from 680,000 pounds a year to over 5.1 million pounds a year. I mean, it was a silver gold mine. Even American merchants got in on the action, selling Turkish opium to China. But this started to tip the scales too far in the other direction, now with the Chinese silver reserves reaching unsustainable levels, not to mention the effects on the general population. Before, the average British consumer was just sipping their Chinese tea from ornate porcelain cups while relaxing in their comfy silk robes. Now, the average Chinese consumer was struggling to detach themselves from their pipe. Although the Chinese emperor had outright banned opium usage, it didn't stop the average fella from getting their fix. Millions upon millions were addicted, leading to a drastic decline in productive laborers, merchants, farmers, and teachers. Well, in 1839, the Chinese emperor put his silky slippered foot down. Severe punishments were put in place for anyone dabbling in deals of opium. All imports of the stuff were seized and destroyed. Famously, the kickstart of the Opium War was the seizure and destruction of over 2.9 million pounds of opium in one go. The British were not pleased with getting shafted out of payment for the product, so they demanded reparations. At cannon point. Just a year later in 1840, a British naval fleet positioned itself off of China's eastern coast and began bringing the heat, bullying various islands into submission as to establish a base of operations. Let's take a look at the roster for both sides. The British in this campaign commanded over 19,000 soldiers and 37 ships. Standing in China's corner, though, was an estimated 100,000 mobilized infantry. China had the numbers, but Britain had the technology. Chinese fortresses? Demolished. Resistance groups? Destroyed. Innocent civilian generational homesteads? Deleted. Campaigning up the Pearl River, the British blasted their way to the Chinese commercial heart of Canton, still hell-bent on getting their compensation. Sir, the British are here. Both parties sat down at a pretty cool-looking table and agreed to peace terms. But the overarching powers in charge, mainly the Qing Emperor and the British Foreign Secretary, refused said terms, prompting the supersaturated British to withdraw from the Pearl and shoot up the Yangtze River to clog any and all economic arteries. This forced China to renegotiate the peace conditions, resulting in the drafting of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. As a result, opium usage remained illegal, but new trade ports would be open to British imports, which, hilariously enough, was still royal shit tons of opium. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to the British as a colony, and China was forced to pay nearly 26 million silver dollars in reparations to the British. This comes out to roughly $830 million in purchasing power, or roughly $1.3 billion in silver value alone. Now, there was a second opium war a few decades later, but just like a bunch of farmers winning 2 donkey auctions, the Chinese got their asses handed to them a second time. This one's a classic. Now, I briefly ran through this one in my History Facts You Wouldn't Believe Are True video, but let's revisit it with a deeper understanding and some better artwork. The Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the record as the shortest war in known human history, lasting just 38 minutes. I mean, your commute home is probably longer than that.
You're listening to D101 The Shaft. All other radio stations can suck a dick.
The reasoning behind the war was very simple. By the end of the 1800s, Zanzibar was a major trade hub off the eastern coast of Africa. Whoever controlled it had massive influence in the region's exchange of goods, including spices, ivory, and the frequent slave or two, including all profits that go with it. With European powers scrambling for Africa, Britain needed to cement its ability to control trade, hence the discussion about it taking Egypt in the first chapter. But Zanzibar was also unethically up for grabs. A treaty was signed in 1890, and the nation of Zanzibar, while remaining independent, became a British protectorate, meaning that the British technically held power over Zanzibar, but it could self-govern with guaranteed British protection should things go awry. On August 25, 1896, the British Empire's favorite Sultan, along with his esteemed beard, received a sudden and premature ticket to paradise. Some believe he may or may not have been poisoned, but no proof has ever surfaced to support that claim. What's suspicious, though, is that the Sultan's less impressive facial hair having cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, decided to claim the throne for himself while the previous Sultan's body was still warm. Oh, and fun fact, this same guy lost out on the throne just 3 years prior. Highly suspicious, one might say, fingering their mustache. Unfortunately for Khalid, only a British-approved Sultan could sit on the throne. Unfortunately for the British, he didn't give a fuck. In case you didn't know, the name Khalid in Arabic means immortal or everlasting, a name that was about to be put to the test using multiple British gunboats just strapped to the tits with cannons and machine guns. On August 26th, the very next day after the Sultan had just died, Khalid was given an ultimatum: surrender by 9 AM the next morning or be converted into a fine red mist. Khalid refused, not believing that the British had the balls to actually do anything about it. As a precaution, he had assembled a small army of his own, including a few outdated cannons and guns, but the comparison of firepower was laughable. Multiple warnings were given to the usurper the next morning, up until an hour before the deadline. However, the warnings fell on deaf ears. The clock struck the hour, 9 AM. The air was still with a deafening silence so quiet, you could hear a subscribe button click. The order was given. The gunboats unleashed their volleys on the Sultan's palace for 38 minutes. Suffice to say, it was completely destroyed. After the guns fell silent, over 500 men and women, mostly innocent civilians, lay dead. The British suffered only one injury, a simple splinter from flying debris. As for Khalid, he snuck off into hiding but was eventually captured and exiled. That afternoon, the British placed a new approved Sultan in place, and within a few weeks a new palace was built. A happy ending for most. This episode of Chat History is called Emu War. Listen, I know the subject has been beaten to death worse than a wife at an alcoholics convention, but now it's my turn. Back in 1932, the inverted hellhole that is Australia had one heck of a problem. After the Great War, returning veterans needed something to help them cope with the fact that they just lived through the most traumatic event of their lives. So far. In order to supply such a remedy, the Australian government encouraged returning veterans to settle on remote farmland out west. This relaxing, freeing, open-air experience hypothetically would do the mind and body good for the recovering war heroes. But with a lack of farming experience and putting said low-level farmers in less than ideal agricultural conditions, it became way more of a burden than a life of leisure. Oh yeah, and that Great Depression thing was going on. What, you thought that was just a United States thing? No. It was a worldwide catastrophe. To throw even more salt in the wound, wheat prices were taking a pounding. So not only was it a pain to grow, but yielding any wheat, ironically enough, wasn't netting much bread. But then comes the main villain of the story. With environmental, mental, and financial odds stacked against them, the Aussies faced one more foe. The dreaded emu. Bleh. Actually, it was more like 20,000 emus. A massive mob of the flightless birds had migrated from more central regions of the outback towards the west in search of cooler temperatures and more fruitful areas for public mastication. Unfortunately for the aspiring farmers, such a source of sustenance was their main cash crop. The wheat. The emus swarmed the farmlands, consuming everything in their wake, so the farmers phoned the government. Oi, government! These right cunts are eating on me crops! The news spread quickly, making it all the way up to the Minister of Defense, who approved a military intervention to deal with the pest problem. The solution? A few lead pills administered through an ergonomic dispenser. They were gonna shoot them. Deployed onto the field were 2 Lewis light machine guns with approximately 10,000 rounds and a military vehicle for mobility. The basic idea was to scare off the flocks and send them back where they came from, or at least somewhere that wasn't farmland. But things of course didn't go according to plan. To make up for the fact that they're flightless, emus are extreme sprinters, capable of topping out at around 30 miles an hour. Also keep in mind that emus can stand as tall as 6.5 feet and weigh over 130 pounds, so these feathered balls of rage were no pushovers. Righto, let's open her up. The emus were slippery little devils, able to weave in and out of the gunfire pretty effectively. They ran around all over the place, tearing up crops in the process. But the real kick in the dick here is that they refused to relocate away from their newfound food source. After a few weeks, only a few hundred emus were slain, barely a dent in the total population. So the government tried again, improving ambush tactics and rallying locals to help out. They were way more successful, bringing the kill count to about 1,000. Still only about 5% of the estimated population. The Australian government threw in the towel, with the public deeming the operation a waste of government resources amidst a global economic crisis. Despite staring down the barrel of a machine gun, the emus were declared the victors. For now. In addition to erecting more effective fencing, the government turned to the everyday citizen for help, providing free or subsidized ammo for some good old-fashioned giant bird hunting. Within just 6 months, over 50,000 bounties had been claimed and paid out, and over the next few decades, this number grew to nearly 300,000. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.